We're now moving into part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 80, where we're sharing BlackRock versus the world. Because people think that they are in a trade war between USA and China. And I'd like you to know that that is a distraction. And so what I want to do is I want to help you understand the real power structure of the world. I've always called it a proof of weapons network. The reason is because this debt-based Ponzi scheme created by a central bank in order to obfuscate the funding of war, in order to get countries deep into debt, started with the Bank of England in 1694, and then moved to the current iteration, which is the Federal Reserve in 1913, and then morphed into a new stateless structure led by BlackRock as the new CEO of the Proof of Weapons Network. And so what you often see is that people have outdated narratives, because with macro and geopolitics and power structures, there is always a morphing and a fluidity. When operations go right and wrong, capital gets redistributed and models change. I've always been sharing people, how this came from the elite families, and the central banks were funding wars in order to take over resources, and then using banks in order to get a monopoly on the creation of the dollar and the pound and the euro. And then wars led to organizations like the Bank for International Settlements to take mercantilism, where gold is transferred into a new power structure, and then the world order changes. And then you had the Bretton Woods system, which required World War II in order to set up. And then you had the default by America in 1971, where they stopped the convertibility of the dollar into gold. And now you entered into the full fiat currency proof of weapons network, where there was no check and control on the amount of war that could be created and the amount of debt. And so you entered into this ginormous twin deficit that America, by policy, deliberately went into because it was controlled by a larger force. So central banks were a mechanism of stealing wealth, wiping out the middle class, getting the government bigger and bigger and bigger, turning a capitalist country into an oligarchy, a socialist country, and eventually at its extreme, like in Europe, almost like communism through a central bank digital currency, which I think we're transitioning to in Europe by the end of this year and throughout 2026. But this central banking debt-based Ponzi scheme is a way of creating a macro game to change the rules where it doesn't really matter who's in charge. The famous Rothschild quotes were, give me control over money and I care not who writes the laws. That is the reality, because when you have a monopoly over the currency, you're able to control the game and you're able to buy the politicians. And then you can pretend that it is a democracy when you in fact have an oligarchy through a shadow covert network rather than an overt type of position as well. So anyway, central banks decentralized. So originally you had the Bank of England, and then when the power structure went over to the Federal Reserve, and there were a couple more central banks in between and many others, but I want to simplify it for now. The shareholders of the Federal Reserve were the large global banks. And the large global banks were headed up by the rich families, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. And we know that they merged into each other at different times as well. When JP Morgan passed away, he only had 20% of his wealth. 80% was distributed across Rothschild networks and very other European families. So while there is often a US front, there is also a European front as well. Now, over time, they used deregulation through Glass-Steagall Act, where you could create the digital dollar, the digital pound, the digital euro, and all the different currencies. And you could combine it with investment banking, where you could socialize all the losses and get a bailout through the retail bank. But then you could also create financial products that had no reserves or requirements on them at all. And you could create a shadow banking system via investment banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. I worked for an investment bank called KBC, the largest Dutch investment bank when I was working in corporate finance. But you're able to financialize and securitize everything, the political process, every single company. And those large banking families over time kept some of their positions through trusts and blind trusts, but they mainly sold them into the public markets as well to diversify into gold and hard assets. So they always fall back upon hard money because they know that the long-term wealth is hard money. And today we have physical hard money, gold. Silver's not really hard money. It's more industrial. The supply is not known. The stock to flow is not good. And then you have Bitcoin, which was the hardest form of digital money through this proof of work network. And those are the two forms of hard money that exist today. Now, obviously, they use other types of assets like art and various other types of things to preserve wealth, whether it be wine or whiskey and various other stuff. But main thing is gold and now Bitcoin today. And so they could sell all their shares and move over to hard money. And then they could use these different stocks to borrow, rinse out all the money, hyper financialize, and create a derivative market that dwarfs the real economy. And so this is what you have. And you have like a multi-quadrillion market. And then what they do is they use as collateral loans to the US government. And therefore they can influence this process of what the rate to borrow is, who to borrow, which banks to send bust. And this is what you really saw during the global financial crisis in 2008. So the public markets were used. And what you can also do is you can buy back your stock by borrowing through schemes like quantitative easing. And then the executives that are just plants for the shareholders, they can essentially get stock option schemes, and they can get incredibly wealthy on these multi-hundred billion, $1 million salaries and various other things by just pushing up the price of the stock. And by having this quarterly disclosure, you end up in a system that can never change. And so companies have to meet their quarterly profits on the public market. And by having to meet them, they are driven into short-term behavior, which essentially means that they can never have a long-term strategy. And so by having to always, out-defeat the derivatives and the bond vigilantes and those that can get access to capital through hedge funds, you always have to get these good quarterly results. And if you don't, capital moves and capital flows. And then you control the political process by having lobby groups, and where every 2 years you have to meet the interns, and then you have to get new votes and you campaign for more money. And then they can get political favors by getting their money. And then within 4 years, it changes if you don't serve their agenda. And then capital only flows to those that meet the corporate agendas. And underneath that, you have intelligence agencies, what they call the deep state. And so the networks that were set up, like the CIA, MI6, Five Eyes, and Mossad, these are just networks where 10% is for national security, but 90% is to create wars that can then go and fetch resources. You can fund groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, M23, M13. You can create violence in regions, and then you can get access to the rare earth minerals that you need, the gold that you need. It's basically neo-digital mercantilism when the British Empire transferred over to the American Empire, and then they digitized everything, securitized everything, financialized everything, until there was this new, more distributed network of power called the Proof of Weapons Network. And by having these public companies, the old money could swap you're able to exit your position through stocks and end up with hard money at the end of it. The end game is that everyone wants hard money, because all of these different paper products, financial products, derivatives products, they're all subject to manipulation. When the hard money, the supply can never change, and scarcity is what drives value. And that's what's driving the Bitcoin proposition and what drove the gold proposition in the physical world before. Now, what became really interesting is through this deregulated environment and acts like Glass-Steagall, which basically put together retail banking with investment banking where you could create the products, they also combined it with the money management industry. So a large global bank like Barclays would have Barclays Capital, the investment bank, Barclays Commercial and Retail, the retail banks, where they get to create digital money every time they issue a loan, and then Barclays Wealth, where they would actually manage endowment funds, insurance funds. And then they had Barclays iShares, where they would create these products like ETFs. And ETFs were essentially where, rather than everyone having to decide what stocks to buy, you just buy an ETF. And then they buy all those stocks for you, and you get exposure to, say, the 500 largest stocks in America, or the largest stocks in China, or various different sectors. And this company called BlackRock was essentially chosen as the money manager to manage in the future trillions of dollars of assets. They did a couple of things. They created a technology really, really early where they could give money managers technology, governments technology, and central banks technology, where they could manage monetary policy, fiscal policy, and institutional investments and alternative products that would allow them to securitize land, wheat, resources, oil, carbon credits, every product you could possibly imagine through their investment bank. And then they would pull together all of the money through endowment funds, through insurance contributions, through pension contributions to get more and more money. And then they would invest more in this technology that would pull together all of this data of all the money managers in the world. And in fact, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, BlackRock ended up giving that technology to the Federal Reserve to use to determine which banks to go bust, which assets to sell. And so they wiped out some of the banks involved in the proof of weapons money laundering network via Vatican Bank, for example, Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, Jeffrey Epstein's network where he worked, which was a blackmail ring in order to bribe people into the network and have political control, and then handed over to like Jeffrey Epstein's bank, like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, who would receive money from the Federal Reserve, and then they could reposition using this technology and early artificial intelligence that came from military innovation in order to control monetary flows. And during COVID, for example, BlackRock actually gave that technology to Treasury in order to manage the carving up of many different assets around the world so that it could take over the real estate market, the private equity market, the public markets, and it could put more and more consolidation of power until it ended up with trillions and trillions of dollars of assets. And during the global financial crisis, they wiped out the ETF department of Barclays. BlackRock acquired it, and it ended up having all the ETF power, all of the endowment fund money, all of the the pension money, the insurance money, the technology that is being utilized by Treasury for fiscal policy, and the Federal Reserve for monetary policy, and the Bank for International Settlements through the IMF and all of the network of central banks, so that it could be utilized as a ginormous pool of data with all of the money managers that are all relying upon data from this technology in order to move the flows of capital all around the world. And this became the foundation. Now, there were competitors like Vanguard and State Street, and they all invested in each other. And so they all essentially took the shares of all the banks, took all of the different, made them public, and then ended up acquiring more and more and deeper positions. And that gave them board seats on the institutions, as well as you handing over your voting rights, as well as having the technology. And BlackRock was the net winner. And I would say the CEO of the Proof of Weapons Network. Now you have the ability to financialize through your investment banks, to create digital currency through your retail banks, to pool over capital through your money management arms and your fund management, and also direct the flow and influence what companies do through board positions and ETFs and voting rights in those shares. And that is the top of the chain. And then they invest in each other. It's somewhat of a more decentralized network, but through the technology, you can control the flow of capital and engineer games and wars that we'll be covering in the geopolitical section, so that you can take over economies. And it created essentially a state above the state. Some call it the deep state, but it controls intelligence. It controls the money printers. It controls the commercial banks, it controls the money management, and it controls the flow of capital through big data, big compute, artificial intelligence, and also can control which companies can take access to military technologies like Google, like X, like Mark Zuckerberg through Meta and Facebook. And you can utilize, like Tesla, can utilize all of these technologies that were innovated by military for killing people through these covert wars. And then you could give them to certain select companies, and then they could become and utilize and create products based upon government subsidies and carbon credits and manipulating money markets. And you can even short those stocks so that when things go wrong, you can move the flow of capital, and you can pretend that you have capitalism when you have full-blown crony communism via oligarchy and centralized power and centralized control in an covert network of control where people think that they're in charge and they've got a democracy. This is where we are right now. And when we go through this a little bit deeper, I'd like you to understand the propaganda that people put out there, so that this is all for you to get ahead of the game. Because the only way I'm able to get ahead of these games is because I don't listen to propaganda. I don't listen to what politicians say. I just look what they're doing with their money. I follow monetary flows, and I update people every week so that they can do the same as well. And so this is how you change the power structure. And I put it to you, the current power structure is not the Rothschild families, is not the Federal Reserve. These are just simply nodes in the proof of weapon network, where those that control the capital control everything that's happening in the world right now, including the politicians. Now, people come to me and say, hey, I love Trump. I think Trump is patriotic and MAGA. I say it's not more powerful than BlackRock. BlackRock can create wars. It can assassinate. It can weaponize the CIA, the FBI. It can change the flow of capital. It can blackmail. It can assassinate. It can do whatever it wants through its covert networks, and it can do it all with plausible deniability, with no accountability and no Congress, and it can buy politicians through lobby groups and essentially change the structure of where military money goes, when the bank wins, where large loans go. And this is the power structure that makes the large decisions. And you think that Trump, that may have lawfare, debt, connections to Jeffrey Epstein from his real estate deals, assassination attempts, you think that he can come up against BlackRock? Nobody becomes a president unless they do what the proof of weapons network wants them to do. And that's why everything that's happening with tariff policies is as follows. And remember when I said this tariffs is not going to redistribute to Main Street, build the manufacturing base, and make America great again. This is the strategy of BlackRock that will have three impacts. And by BlackRock, I mean the whole network. But BlackRock is the CEO, so we'll call it BlackRock right now. And Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock. What the implementation of tariff policies are is that firstly, is it will wipe out middle businesses. It will have a redistribution of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, because the large organizations that BlackRock controls will be able to get access to capital through the proof of weapons network to do M&A and acquire the distressed companies, so that the Magnificent Seven, for example, that all have their largest shareholders as Blackguard, State Street, Vanguard as well, can basically acquire and do deals with the Trump administration. The Trump administration negotiates for the BlackRock portfolio of companies, ports, land, deals, and all of the wealth is socialized across Main Street and privatized across Wall Street and the money managers. Now, what about the deals that are happening globally? Well, the deals that are happening globally are because the countries that are under the thumb of the International Monetary Fund is now deciding that the countries that have the sovereign wealth, and by sovereign wealth, I mean, if you want world reserve currency, you have a twin deficit, a trade deficit and fiscal deficit. By design, you can't have world reserve currency and balance your book, because your job is to export dollars, and dollars are debt, globally around the world. And so you use covert wars and terrorism and mercantilism in order to do that overtly and pretend you're fighting for democracy, when really what you're doing is the sovereign wealth is being built up by those countries that don't have a privatized central bank, a privatized debt-based currency through banks, and they don't have resources that are privatized for private interests. Because by privatizing the country's resources and the currency and the banking system, you create a force that is bigger than government, that controls government. That's what Europe has. That's what anyone that has IMF loans has. That is what America has. That is what Europe has, and what Britain has. And that's why, essentially, the governments no longer work for us, because they work for the power structure of the proof of weapons network. So if BlackRock says, don't look after pensions, don't fix streets, don't look after your hospitals and healthcare system, please send billions of dollars to Ukraine so that then we can install our politicians like Zelensky. We can bribe him off, and the money goes back to General Dynamic, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, which we're essentially have board seats on, and we're able to manipulate the share price. And suddenly, in the last quarter, 8% growth in the military companies. We can sacrifice Europe. We can do things like push a ESG narrative at the same time as blowing up through our CIA network, the Nord Stream pipeline, so that Germany, which now has the European Central Bank in charge, can destroy its manufacturing base, switch off the solution to its energy, which is nuclear power. That's the elephant in the room, by the way. Nuclear power is the most efficient, cheapest energy that can power all of this artificial intelligence. But they don't want you to know that. They want you focused on building windmills and various other things, which only countries with a cheap manufacturing base like China can dominate. So they dominate the renewable energy that gets the price of energy down to zero through its cheap manufacturing base. And Germany just essentially goes bankrupt. It can't use its nuclear weapon. It can't get cheap natural gas through Nord Stream pipeline from Russia. And now it has to get expensive gas from America, which destroys the economy, sends it into recession. And then at the same time, the ECB can wipe out all the wealth of the middle class and normal people by engineering the funding of narratives to say Putin is suddenly about Hitler and he's about to take over Europe. And so then they think they're flying democracy, and they wonder why they're choosing between eating and heating. They're in a recession. They can't afford shit. There's civil unrest in their country. Things are getting deteriorated. Their rubbish isn't being collected, but they should cheer along, sending billions of dollars to Lockheed Martin and corrupt politicians because they think that they're fighting for democracy. And then in the meantime, you can carve up the rare earth minerals. You can get BlackRock to own half of Ukraine, and they can financialize and securitize, and you can create nodes like Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer can go to the IMF and they can collateralize the country to financialize it so that BlackRock can end up with the assets, the IMF can issue the loan, and through these collateralized loans, they can engineer the markets in order to end up with the financialization of all the land, divide and conquer, and more power in order to control the network and engineer wars. Now, those countries that don't allow corporations to get bigger than them, don't allow for the privatization of their natural resources so that you have to tax people instead of the resources being used for the people, and that don't have a non-debt-based Ponzi scheme, they end up with all the surplus. And so Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Emiratis ended up with $5 trillion, while America ended up with nothing. But the socialization of the losses to the people and privatization of the gains, and through the BlackRock network, they redistribute capital globally and create these ginormous multinational institutions that are controlled with board seats by BlackRock ETFs, and they can control all of this monetary network. That is how the proof of weapons network, and that is how BlackRock sat. But BlackRock has to negotiate with real sovereign powers, i.e. China, that has a manufacturing base and doesn't have a debt-based Ponzi scheme It has its debt issues because it pumped real estate, but that's a state banking system. And Saudi, which has the sovereign wealth through its resources. And now we get this negotiation, and I'll go through more of it. I covered it last week in the multipolar world order, where essentially BlackRock controls the politicians that are called democracies, and they're negotiating with the countries that are still sovereign, which have the surpluses. And then if you want to change the world order, rather than reforming money and reforming the Federal Reserve, ECB, Bank of England system, you do a PSYOP called tariffs, because you can't fix money with tax reform. And so Trump does tax reform, which essentially wipes out, will eventually wipe out Main Street, because they can't afford the import tax that they're about to pay. And the large corporations can access capital and acquire them. The export dependent countries end up being acquired, essentially as many assets as possible, because they're in debt to the IMF. And the sovereign countries align and go strategically closer, where those that are in debt choose, rather than go to America, which they've got massive tariffs, they go to China instead. And China set up this BRICS network that aligned with the Middle Eastern network called the GCC. And they use that in order to negotiate and take on BlackRock. And the banking network that funded the Trump administration is aligned with this multipolar world order. And so therefore, all you need to do is engineer games that reset the world order, which is the tariff policy and everything we're implementing right now. But you need the people to believe, just like in Europe and Britain, you needed the people to believe that their government is still a democracy and that Putin is Hitler, and they should send all their money for the profits of BlackRock. Now America needs to do the same. So America, because BlackRock is the stateless, more powerful institution, they're saying, let's build up the rest of the world, and let's take what we used to do through the central banking system to Africa, to the global south, and let's do it upon the host nation. Let's do it to Europe. Let's do it to Britain. Let's create civil unrest. Let's do it to America. And so you have this environment of never using the money to actually help Americans. And then you make them believe through a narrative called MAGA, Make America Great Again. And we're going to rebuild the manufacturing base, and we're going to redistribute wealth away from Wall Street over to Main Street. And then you do the opposite while it's happening. And that's exactly what is happening right in front of us right now. Now, at the same time, you need people to believe that the opposite is happening. And so while the Trump administration is going short on the dollar through stablecoins, long on Bitcoin, the central banks are buying gold, and BlackRock is repositioning capital globally and taking on wars in order to reposition new power structures around the world. Americans think that this is some kind of revolution called Liberation Day, when the reality is you're liberating the world from the dollar and you're moving to this multipolar world order. And so today there is no trade war. It doesn't exist. The trade war already happened. That was the Federal Reserve versus PBOC in a multi-decade strategy, and China ended up with all the assets and the manufacturing base, and the Federal Reserve gave all the profits to the banks and gave away and sold off all the assets of America, Europe, and Britain to those who had money. And now they're negotiating foreign direct investment, which is the takeover from the oligarchy and corporatocracy and technocracy of the country, and managing that transition so that these countries are in these different battles between China and BlackRock, and the Saudi Arabia and the GCC and BlackRock. And pretty much you could take those three power structures, BlackRock representing the complete asset stripping of the people of the West, with China that remains sovereign and Saudi Arabia that remains sovereign. And those are the three power structures that we have. There's a bit more to it, but I want to simplify down. Then what you need is through Operation Mockingbird, to have narratives that make it acceptable to the people. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get Azad to play a video. And I've done interviews with Daniela. I'm not saying anyone, most people don't know who they work for. You know, you get sponsorship, you invite on guests. Some people look like they're influencers, but they're sponsored by someone. And then you don't know who is ahead of the sponsorship. So some people don't even know that they're a useful idiot for the military industrial complex and spreading propaganda. But I would like to play an interview that I think I'd like to retranslate, just like I did with the Scott Bessent interview, so that you can understand how this game works. Because they need you to believe that the opposite of what is happening is currently happening to make it acceptable to you. So Azad, let's play the interview of what I consider to be, you know, it's not an attack on the character, but CIA proof of weapons network sponsored propaganda to make what is happening right now acceptable to the American people, while there is a massive redistribution of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, and they asset strip all of your assets, just like they did to the Brits in the UK and the Europeans in Europe. So Azad, let's play the interview.
The Chinese economy is facing desperate times. This is the warning of my guest today, Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang, and author of Plan Red, China's Plan to Destroy America. Gordon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daniela.
Look, this is developing minute by minute here. You say and warn, look, China is tough, but Trump is tougher. How does this play out for you?
This is going to be a long struggle, and part of it is because I think Xi Jinping has boxed himself in. He has configured the Chinese political system so that only the most hostile answers are considered to be acceptable. And for about a half decade, he has told the Chinese people that China has already surpassed the United States, which means that if he gives in to Trump, or even if he just reacts to pressure to begin negotiations, that undermines everything that he's told the Chinese. And so I think that that makes it very difficult for him to come to terms. And we've seen this in this controversy over the last couple of days, where you have President Trump saying, we've been talking to the Chinese about trade, and the Chinese saying, no, there are no trade discussions at all. And I think that's a real indication that the Chinese really find themselves in a hard position. Now, of course, we don't know outside. People on the outside, like me, don't know 100% who's telling the truth.
Right.
But we do know one thing, and that is that the United States and China talk to each other all the time. I mean, forget about the trade war. Forget about the tariff war. We talk to each other all the time. So, you know, for the Chinese to say that there have been no discussions about trade, especially with all of the tariffs, that's not very credible.
This begs the question.
Okay, so look, let me give some commentary on that. So this is laying the framework for you believing that America is winning when the trade war has already been won. This is the execution of the fact that America already lost the trade war, but it didn't lose. The American people lost the trade war because they sold the entire economy off to BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. And so while it is asset stripping, it needed to change the narrative away from Biden that's taking us to World War III to Trump that's going to make America great again and implement tariffs for the American people. And they need you to believe that that China is about to collapse. And they built those narratives because they said, because China has a state banking system, they want you to believe that it's the same as the Federal Reserve System. So when they have overinvestment in real estate and large amounts of debt for the people, they're basically, making you think that this is the same as the Federal Reserve System. But it's not, because it's the complete opposite. So China has the reserves. It's a surplus country with trade surplus and vast reserves and vast gold reserves. And so they want you to believe that they're about to crash and they're about to die because they've got the same leverage that America has, which has a privatized banking system. And so, they need that type of propaganda. They also need you to believe that the people of China are like the American people, where they're constantly fighting over the left and the right. Well, no, they don't engage much in politics. Look, I'm not telling you what I think is a good system. I'm telling you what is the system that we have today. I'm not engaging in what I want the system to be. I'm telling you what the system is so that you can understand it, because they're just point blank lying to you with this type of propaganda. And so what China has done is they did the opposite of the IMF model. They went around to countries and said, we're not going to regime change you. We're not going to violently overthrow you. We're going to invest in your infrastructure like we invested in our people, where generally, while the people may not like our authoritarian style, but in general, they're significantly wealthier. And we've switched from communism to regional capitalism, but we keep our resources for our people rather than taxing the people at a very high rate. And so they end up with fast trains. They end up with investment in education. They end up with infrastructure. They end up with capital controls. Now, you may not like capital controls, but it meant China didn't sell its economy to America. So now it's not controlled by foreign, just like now $27 trillion of assets are owned by China and the Saudis, and Trump's going to Saudi Arabia saying, please invest 1.4 trillion into our artificial intelligence, assets, stripping the assets and handing it over to foreign control. And so they did the opposite of that. They said, we'll invest, but we won't interfere in your country. And they built this network of people that were able to get access to their technology. And they were allowed to govern their country in that way without being overthrown or told that they need to have a central bank installed that takes away all of the wealth from their people through a debt-based Ponzi scheme. So it built all of these allegiances across Africa, across the global south, across the BRICS network. And once the sanctions were weaponized, it drew everyone closer, where the BRICS countries and the GCC, the Gulf countries, aligned in order to merge those BRICS. So you had UAE, Saudi Arabia kind of joined, but instead of going to the G7 meeting, went to the BRICS meeting, which is a signal that he's saying we're slowly managing this relationship between America and BRICS. And now we're very, very influential. And now we're aligned with BlackRock. So BlackRock, which wants to invest and make more money working with us, can change the world order. And then all of the people, all of the politicians, they get to invest in this new world order, make a load of money while they're exerting this. And they just need you to believe that this relationship doesn't exist, that in fact, there's not about to be a revolution in the country because people are overthrowing their government because they hate them so much. I'm not saying some don't, but the ones that do, they ended up leaving the country. And so you get this warped view from the people that didn't like it and left the country, that decided to stay within America, which is different to the ones that stayed. And so that shapes the narrative. It's called a fifth column. And then you can shape the narrative whenever you want to exert influence over the country where the immigrants came from. And so, look, that's the reality. China's already won this trade war, and tariff is the execution. But they need you to believe that America's about to win, a deal's about to be announced, and the deal will take 3 years to negotiate anyway. And all the details have already been figured out. It's just, this is the implementation of the multipolar world order based upon some of the physical wars that were fought around the world that led to, this situation where America had to strategically retreat because all of the assets were sold off and the credit card was maxed out. And now they need to roll over $10 trillion and their partners are no longer lending. So Japan's saying, if you don't do a deal with us, then we'll sell. These are basically ASEAN and Asia are realigning around the new power structure of the world and accumulating assets. And BlackRock is essentially being negotiated by the Trump administration. So none of the benefit is for the American people. It's all for the corporations that are global in nature get better deals and will get to acquire Main Street. It's just like COVID. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Only the large can survive. And so, yeah, he wants you to believe that that is what is happening in China. Again, I'm not dealing in what I want the system to be. I'm dealing in what the system is. And you need to either step into common sense corner or believe the Operation Mockingbird CIA propaganda that feeds you, and then you won't protect yourself because you think that they're gonna actually make America great again and look after you. All the meanwhile, BlackRock is planning how to destroy the economy and utilize any useful assets like it's doing in Europe and turn America into a technocratic AI, robotics, artificial intelligence center powered by stable coins where only money is used in order to serve the agenda of BlackRock's portfolio and its proof of weapons network. And if you protest too much, they've already beta tested all the technology in the Middle East, and all of that Middle East violence is going towards Europe. So Europe is got another $1 trillion it needs to give to BlackRock's portfolio companies. And then at the same time, you agitate a war in India, and we'll go through that more in the geopolitical section. So anyway, all of this to say is that this was all about believing that the situation in America is the situation in China. Let's go to the next question.
The Chinese economy is facing desperate times. This is
where you have President Trump saying, we've been talking to the Chinese about trade, and the Chinese saying, no, there are no trade discussions at all. And I think that's a real indication that the Chinese really find themselves in a hard position. Now, of course, we don't know outside, people on the outside like me don't know 100% who's telling the truth.
right.
But we do know one thing, and that is that the United States and China talk to each other all the time. I mean, forget about the trade war. Forget about the tariff war. We talk to each other all the time. So, for the Chinese to say that there have been no discussions about trade, especially with all of the tariffs, that's not very credible.
This begs the question, Gordon, who needs who more? China? Does China need the U.S. or does the U.S. need China?
Oh, that one's clear. China needs the U.S. more. First of all, we are the larger economy. China's economy is less than 2/3 the size of ours. More important, we're the trade deficit country. Last year, China's merchandise trade surplus against the U.S. was $295.4 billion. That was up 5.8% from 2023. But also, remember, China is a trade-dependent economy, export-dependent, because Xi Jinping has turned his back on consumption as the fundamental basis of the Chinese economy, which means that the only way for him to rescue a desperate situation is to export more. And one other thing, China's right now probably contracting. It's not growing at the 5.4% pace that they reported for Q1. And we see this from, for instance, price data for February and March, where the CPI was down for 2 consecutive months, and the producer price index, which measures factory gate prices, that was down in March for the 30th straight month. That says deflation. And I think that really says, look, China, maybe it's growing, but it's probably contracting. So you have all of these factors at the same time. And that means President Trump, at least from the objective factors, he holds almost all the high cards.
What about reports?
Okay, absolutely everything he just said is the opposite of what's the truth. And so this is such state-sponsored propaganda. All right, so let's look at this. A global recession will impact everybody. But the country that is over-leveraged is the one that can't survive the recession. Unless you print more money, which brings you into a QE hyperinflationary cycle. Not hyperinflationary, let's call it inflationary cycle. And redistributes wealth. And at the moment, America, almost all of its consumption is the top 10% of wealthy people in America. And so the consumption is debt. And if you go into a global recession, you end up making the debt situation worse while long-term rates are going higher, while America has to refinance $10 trillion of debt. So if you are leveraged, you can't survive a global recession without a radical change in the world order. Now, will that impact China? Absolutely. A global recession will impact everybody. So let's have a look at China. China exports 10 to 15% of its goods to America, and America needs the credit card and the rolling over of the debt in order to continue to do that. So that money is gone anyway, and particularly if you set a tariff policy that resets the world order. That then drives all the countries closer to China, and now those countries are now consuming from China rather than America. So rather than buying the iPhone, you're buying the iPhone from China, or you're buying Huawei or whatever, different technology you're buying from China in order to not pay the tariff. So now you have replaced the consumption of America's credit card by drawing the relationships closer to China. Now, China has 1.4 billion people, approximately the second largest population now. And so those 1.4 billion people were built upon savings. Now, yes, they got over leveraged because they bought real estate in the state banking model, but this is a nation of savers that can consume. And because they have a state banking system, the leverage is internal within its own country. It's not foreign controlled, like America debt is foreign controlled. So Japan and China can say, I'll sell all the treasuries, I won't buy it. And then they've got to create an elaborate scheme in order to find lower quality buyers of their treasuries by issuing stable coins and backing it by those treasuries and then using it to buy Bitcoin and various other things. Okay, so everything that he just said is that the country, obviously global recession affects everyone. Growth will go down, no doubt. GDP will go down. Everyone's impacted. But essentially, the consumption within China, which is 1.4 billion people, can take a chunk of the economy. The Belt and Road Initiative that is invested in the global south, and while the GCC, the Gulf countries, are demonetizing the IMF. When the IMF, USAID, NATO shrink away from those regions, they're allowed to grow again. They can use their own resources, and then they can build an economy that actually is not oppressed by the terrorism of the dollar and the pound and the euro. And so they get to do what those covert wars, because you're demonetizing the petrodollar, you're demonetizing the euro dollar, and you're creating asset stripping within these economies where only the rich are able to consume. And so the consumption can totally be made up. But even if it can't, it's got the reserves, it's got the non-leverage, it's got the gold reserves. And even though they'll report to you, yeah, China's only got 2,500 tons of gold. Come on, nobody believes that. The investigations that I've seen into the different shell companies at which it holds it through the state banking system is 22.5 tons of gold. America had to end the gold window because it only ended up with 8.5 tons of gold. And if you want to cause a real weakening of the dollar, audit Fort Knox. And if it's not there, you can strategically weaken the dollar, reset the world order, and you have all of these tools to manage that transition over time. And so all this to say, there is problems with demographics in China. There is over leveraging of the real estate market. And there is 10% or 15% of its exports that rely upon American consumption that China can totally weather the storm and America can't. And so either you shrink the economy into a regional power, do a monetary reform, asset strip it like they did with Europe, or you roll over the QE scheme and you take it into an inflationary cycle and wealth redistribution. That's why I said this week, and I said last week, the Fed won't lower rates and the Fed won't do QE. The reason that I know that is because I believe that they're going through this transitionary phase rather than doing business as usual. Okay. So once you understand that, you recognize that the state propaganda needs you to believe that America has all the cards. China has all the cards. And that's the reality. Give me another argument in the comments. I've debated people on Spaces, and I'll go through the policy and tell you based on my 25 years experience in economics, working in investment banking, investing, being involved in investing in over 100 all of that experience, bankruptcies, all the stuff I've been through. I can show you what I believe to be, and you can give me the counter argument. So I'll see you on Spaces if you want to debate it, and I'll see you in the comments below if you'd like to tell me why that's not the case. Azad, let's go to the next question.
That China has been preparing. The Chinese economy is facing desperate times. This is
$95.4 billion. That was up 5.8% from 2023. But also, remember, China is a trade-dependent economy, export-dependent, because Xi Jinping has turned his back on consumption as the fundamental basis of the Chinese economy, which means that the only way for him to rescue a desperate situation is to export more. And one other thing, China's right now probably contracting. It's not growing at the 5.4% pace that they reported for Q1. And we see this from, for instance, price data for February and March, where the CPI was down for 2 consecutive months, and the producer price index, which measures factory gate prices, that was down in March for the 30th straight month. That says deflation. And I think that really says, look, China, maybe it's growing, but it's probably contracting. So you have all of these factors at the same time. And that means President Trump, at least from the objective factors, he holds almost all the high cards.
What about reports, Gordon, that China has been preparing for this moment? They've been looking for partners outside of the U.S. There was the whole Reset Summit with other Asian nations of them uniting and forming some sort of alliance to defeat the U.S.?
Yeah, Xi Jinping went to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia recently. Now, Cambodia is a Chinese vassal, so I'm sure that Xi Jinping got everything he wanted out of Cambodia. But Malaysia and Vietnam are much more dependent on the U.S. So, for instance, Vietnam, which is the most important of those 3 countries, they run a trade deficit with China. They have a big trade surplus with us. And just after Xi Jinping left, a senior Vietnamese official said that the relationships between Hanoi and Washington were of core importance to the Vietnamese. So, I mean, that was basically Vietnam saying to Xi Jinping, yeah, it was nice you were here, glad you stopped by, but no, we're not going to let you decimate our economy. Daniela, the one thing here is that because of Trump's tariffs, he has shut a lot of Chinese products out of the United States. That means Xi Jinping's got to sell them somewhere. Countries are not going to allow the Chinese to decimate their economies with the goods they would have otherwise sold the U.S. And in fact, India just slapped the 12% tariff on steel to prevent the Chinese from flooding the Indian market with Chinese steel that otherwise would have been sold to America.
Well, that's why you...
Okay, pause there, Azad. Let's go to the next section. Right. Okay, so let's deconstruct it. So China has been preparing for this for a long time because they were involved in a cold trade war, a proxy war. And this has been building and brewing for a long time. BlackRock, who is in charge of America, Europe, and has financialized and securitized, while the other countries have built their sovereign wealth, have already been preparing for all of this. This is why BRICS was originally created, where they aligned their economies. Because Russia, Iran, and China had to align, during the CIA operation to destroy Europe through the Ukraine war to end up with all the resources and carve up the land for BlackRock, there are countries all around the world. Vietnam remembers that 50 years ago, they were being obliterated in the Vietnamese War. And America lost it. And the goal of the war is always a forever war. I've been Vietnam. I remember those war museums. I defy anyone to go to those war museums and see the people that had chemical weapons blown up upon them that are still in the streets, decapitated and all sorts of, sorry, not decapitated, but, their legs chopped off, all sorts of stuff. You go to Vietnam. If anyone's been there, I've been there. I've traveled the world. Bitcoin took me around the world to all of these different countries. I got to experience, what the impact of these wars actually are. And the reality is that the ASEAN countries had a conference and they all said that the order is being reset. They recognize that this is liberation day from the dollar after abuse by the International Monetary Fund. And now this is the time to actually become a sovereign nation by forming new partnerships. Now, India has a debt-based Ponzi scheme monetary system. And what was India? India was a propped up economy by BlackRock. So what did India do? Well, firstly, it was fueling the military industrial complex. It became the third largest purchaser of weapons. And during the Russian sanctions, India was allowed to purchase Russian gas and sell it on to Europe. And so they built a growth and a temporary growth in the economy based upon debt and loans from BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. And so they implemented the model of propagandizing its people, creating civil unrest, creating racial and religious tensions, and radicalizing its people so that they could get it ready and prepped and justified for war, so that it could take all of the previous damage of the British Empire when they left Kashmir, Pakistan, and India in ruins, and they could take all of that racial and religious tensions, caste system, all sorts of stuff, and they could control narrative in order to ratchet up and create false flag operations so that they could financialize and securitize the whole Indian economy. And so by giving it this fake subsidy, BlackRock is now able to invest more through the banking system, is able to control more of the Indian economy, is able to sell $80 billion of weapons a year to India. And China has already built the Belt and Road Initiative with Pakistan. So Pakistan essentially becomes strategically weakened and a vassal state for China, drawing Pakistan and those routes closer to China, more on the BRICS narrative, while BRICS is invested and aligned with this new multipolar world order, but they try and get as much control as they can by turning India into a debt-based Ponzi scheme, just like they did in America and Europe and Britain. So they're now trying to find their host nations to destroy the wealth of the people and hand it over to large industries and do essentially the wealth transfer model, but within India. So the ASEAN conference, they all came closer. They created alternative payment system outside of the dollar. The BRICS were all strategically aligned. And because of the proxy war in Israel by America in order to create division within the Middle East, the GCC had all of the economic power by partnering and normalizing with Israel and America. And they were now able to exert that and get to where we are today, that we'll cover in the geopolitical section, but essentially have peace in the Middle East, a new region of normalization, and align with the GCC blocks, the ASEAN blocks, and the BRICS blocks have all aligned to strategically allow for this transition to finally being liberated from the dollar. And he wants you to believe that all of those relationships are going to go to America while they're implementing a tariff war to deliberately just negotiate deals for BlackRock and BlackRock's portfolio company. And so Trump is just a salesman for BlackRock's portfolio company at this stage. Nothing's going to help Americans. Everything's going to help his backers. And that's because of the structure that I covered at the beginning of this for the proof of weapons network, where no government, no president works for the people. They just simply work for the corporate interest that controls the system. And so that's India. And that's how we're going to get the opposite of what he said. Next question.
They run a trade deficit with China. They have a big trade surplus with us. And just after Xi Jinping left, a senior Vietnamese official said that the relationships between Hanoi and Washington were of core importance to the Vietnamese. So, I mean, that was basically Vietnam saying to Xi Jinping, yeah, it was nice you were here, glad you stopped by, but no, we're not going to let you decimate our economy. Daniela, the one thing here is that because of Trump's tariffs, he has shut a lot of Chinese products out of the United States. That means Xi Jinping's got to sell them somewhere. Countries are not going to allow the Chinese to decimate their economies with the goods they would have otherwise sold the U.S. And in fact, India just slapped a 12% tariff on steel to prevent the Chinese from flooding the Indian market with Chinese steel that otherwise would have been sold to America.
Well, that's why you raised a really good point. And, you know, we saw Scott Bessett's points that we want to help them. We want to get them on the right side of the page. But then I was speaking to, investor Kevin O'Leary, who would say, but look what they did when we invited them into the World Trade Organization. Then they never abided by the rules. So why do we think that they're going to be accommodative or listen now?
Well, Scott Bessent was trying to talk to the markets, trying to appease them. But what he said was, 100% right. Yes, of course, China needs to rebalance. But what it ignores is Xi Jinping does not believe in consumption as the basis of the Chinese economy. Matter of fact, last couple of years, consumption's contribution to gross domestic product has declined. It's now about 38, 39%, like one of the lowest in the world. Xi Jinping wants a wartime economy. He doesn't believe in empowering Chinese citizens. And also, he does not want to offend core Communist Party constituencies, especially the state banks. So Scott Bessent can say those things, and maybe Americans will say, oh, yeah, that sounds right. But we've been saying that to the Chinese for a couple decades now. I mean, so, I look at that and just shake my head and say, what Scott Bessent should have said was, we've said all these things for 2 decades. Exactly. The Chinese are absolutely determined not to listen to us, so we're going to impose costs. Now, that would have tanked the markets, but at least he would have been telling the truth.
Very good point.
Okay, so pause there. Right. So we did the Scott Bessent interview in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 77. You're welcome to go through that. I won't go through that again. But this is the gaslighting of the lies. This is, they're making it out like America got ripped off by the Chinese. Here's what happened. America ripped off its own people. America set up a debt-based Ponzi scheme through the Federal Reserve that handed over control of the profits from creating money to the private banking sector. The private banking sector that is not America first decided that it would not use its money to lend to people to rebuild and make America great. It would maximize profits and use a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to wipe out the middle class and use its power structure to work with the consolidation of power, the control of the government, and the furthering of the deep state and the privatization of all the assets of America. Now, in order to have the world reserve currency so that it could export its dollars around the world, so that it could have an exorbitant privilege that it would allow America and the Federal Reserve to steal all the wealth from the middle class people, it created this debt-based Ponzi scheme, which required it to roll over debt with more debt until they could no longer do that because they couldn't sell bonds. And they carry on doing that until there is massive wealth concentration in the hands of the few that control the political process, and the government is so big that the proof of weapons network ends up with the vast majority of wealth under management, so it can create a deep state government where the government works for their interest and the CIA works for their interest, which is how it was set up all along. And then what they did is they said, in order to have the world reserve currency, Triffin's dilemma says you have to have more and more debt. And so they exported debt around the world through covert wars, making enemies all around the world to steal resources, make enemies all over anyone that was under the boot of the dollar, force them into IMF debt slavery. So people had to destroy their currencies to pay off their dollar debt in a dollar milkshake theory, where instead of investing in their own countries, they had to hold their dollars and lend it to the US government. And then the US government would have the largest liquid bond market in the world, would then fund more wars that would then siphon off more wealth from the Americans, the Europeans, and the Brits into the hands of the privatized corporations that would then hedge and invest and destroy their countries. And so the money, rather than being investing in their own countries, they remain third world because they will have currency wars exerted upon them if they ever do anything against the IMF debt and the central bank in Ponzi. Now that ends up with eventually severe wealth inequality in its own country. And you end up with extreme left and right polarization. And when you don't invest in your people or your education, you end up with people that are radicalized and you know, have very deliberately not been invested in the education. And so therefore you start importing labor from other countries. So Chinese people decided to get an education in America. And you started to end up where the demographic issue, because people are no longer having children because they, essentially can't afford to live anymore. You have to make it up through immigration, and you can weaponize that in order to create civil unrest and narratives of invasions and open border policies, all while the other countries that have built a manufacturing base, invested in their people's education, invested in their country's infrastructure, has people that may not be happy with the government, but people feel that their wealth has grown because they had regional capitalism that had no intellectual property, no copyright, no trademark. So you have the freest form of capitalism at the bottom level, but you're not allowed to become bigger than government so that you can reinvest that money into the country. I'm not saying which model is best, but here's the reality. You had the same model as China, but they privatized the gains and socialized the losses. In China, they had the same model, but it was more overt. You slap a communist label on it. You say, we're the capitalists. You indoctrinate people into believing that this is real communism and real capitalism. And then they are essentially taking their gains and investing in their own people and building up countries and doing a reverse IMF effect. Look, that is the reality of the situation. So the exact opposite of what he's saying is the model. And this was by design, because the Federal Reserve is more important than the government. And this ended up with an alternative power structure where BlackRock would manage all the assets, accumulate all the assets, take over the networks, become the large power broker, and would invest globally where they can change the game at any point. And what did China do with their money? They purchased America. They purchased Europe, and they purchased Britain, as did the Middle Eastern countries. And so now they own the assets, they're the lender, and they hold the assets. And so they don't want to destroy America. They don't want to destroy their investments. They want to continue along the lines of this partnership. But America had a debt-based Ponzi scheme that was the wealth confiscation in direct violation of the Constitution. And everything they sold you about capitalism and democracy was a lie. So once it hits extreme right polarism, they need you to believe it was the commies' fault, the Chinese fault, and everyone around the world is ripping off America. And everybody's ripping off America. And they need you to believe that, because they're facing the consequences of the policy and the lie that they sold you. And they want you to believe that you need to be patriotic to America.
The Chinese
so you end up
economy
holding
is
those
facing
assets. So you end up holding those assets, and you end up the bag holder while all of the sovereign wealth is being built. And they need you to believe this while they manage the transition, because BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network controls every aspect of your political process and all of your assets. And they need you to believe that the government works for you, The Europeans know that nobody in government works for them. The Brits know that. They know that they're being stolen from. But right now, they want you to believe that Trump works for you and he's more in power. He's more important than his power structure. Nobody is. And you know what? The sooner you can recognize it, the sooner you can reposition yourself, reposition your wealth, decide where you want to live, decide what's right for you and your family, and do what they're doing. Investing in Bitcoin, shorting the dollar, buying gold, and having BlackRock reposition their wealth into emerging markets that finally are going to be able to grow. Why? Because BlackRock figured out there's a more profitable money working with the global South rather than and asset stripping the West at the same time. Let's go to the last bit.
Hearing from you, though, overall, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. will come out on top. Trump will win here in his negotiations?
I think Trump will win. China has one card to play, and that is it's trying to pressure Wall Street, Main Street, C-suites, farmers to put pressure on Trump to cave. Most presidents, they probably would cave. Most presidents, we know, wouldn't start this in the first place. Trump's pretty determined. Trump believes that this is the contest, I think, for a very long time. I believe it's a contest for the century, but Trump may not see it in those terms. But Trump believes in tariffs. We know that because during the campaign, he kept on talking about tariffs. He talked about William McKinley, for God's sakes. So clearly he believes this. This is in his heart. And if he has a core belief, tariffs is it.
Gordon, are you at all concerned that this escalates more than a financial war, that it becomes some sort of a military war?
Yep. And the reason is that, you look at the objective factors, basically China doesn't have a way out of this. And Xi Jinping could very well decide that his only way out is actually to cause trouble someplace. Now, I don't think that Xi Jinping would start a war to rally the Chinese people, because we know the Chinese people do not want war. But I think Xi Jinping might think a war would be extremely useful because it would prevent senior Communist Party figures from challenging him. We know that Xi Jinping's hero is Mao Zedong. We know Mao employed this tactic in 1966 when he started the Cultural Revolution. Mao didn't have the ability to start a war, but he did have the ability to start a struggle with other Communist Party figures, and so as to preserve his position in the regime. I think that this is Xi Jinping looking what his hero did, and I think he's going to probably do the same thing. So yes, I'm very worried about that.
With Vietnam?
Okay, let's end it there. Right. Every accusation is a confession. This is pure gaslighting when you understand the truth. Now, what they are doing is they are weaponizing the indoctrination that you have been, for your whole life as an American, as a European, as a Brit, been brought into fear. And that fear is that they need you to believe that the communists are about to take over, while the military-industrial complex steals all your wealth by agitating all the wars around the world. If you look at the track record of the Bank of England that was later taken over by the Federal Reserve, essentially the same system, and if you look through 1694, the first war between the French and the Brits that were funded, all the way through, and I've covered it in Bitcoin Hard Talk, the reality of history, what World War I was actually, and what World War II was actually, and what the Cold War was actually, and what the fake war on terror was actually, and what the wars are being fought right now are actually, is that they were all manufactured wars for the profits of the military-industrial complex that was essentially the model of mercantilism that has led to the fall of the US empire. And rather than going to World War III, because America would have lost World War III, it created a couple of games. One game is its proxy Israel had a time frame in order to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from October the 7th, and I'll go through that in the geopolitical section. The second game was to agitate a war with Russia by doing regime changes and expanding NATO in order to take Europe down and find out whether Russia would capitulate to the American military industrial complex through proxy for the profits of the military industrial complex, so it could carve up everything to BlackRock. And BlackRock initiated those wars. And BlackRock was represented by the military industrial complex and Biden in order to agitate to World War III. And it didn't go to plan. And so therefore, Trump was told, instead of going to World War III, we'll shrink America into a regional power. You can implement the tariffs that you've been talking for years, and we'll split the world up into a multipolar world order. And you can invest in the GCC. You can get a loan from ICBC, the largest bank in China, and you can change America into a technocracy through stablecoins. And you can short the dollar and go long Bitcoin and get as much Bitcoin as you can for you as you manage this transition. And that is exactly what has been implemented. And you need to strategically weaken all of the power that the dollar has in order to use global war to prop up. And now let's look at China and its track record of war. China does not want to reunify with Taiwan. Anytime you hear a narrative, it is CIA sponsored. It is to create a narrative to justify war. So if you hear about the Islamist invasion and the Khalifa and Sharia law being implemented all around the world and they want to take over your country, that is a manufactured narrative. If you hear the commies want to take over the world and communism is the CCP and all of that stuff, that is a manufactured narrative. If you hear that Xi Jinping wants to take over Taiwan because it's got semiconductor chips, the reality is that Taiwan is engaging in trade with China and trade with America. It has a one China policy, but America has been agitating those wars through the genocide and the disaster it created in the Philippines. And the World War II, when it wouldn't even join the war for the Jewish people to prevent the Holocaust, it had to wait until implementing an oil embargo. And then Japan retaliated by taking over a colonized land called Hawaii that the America was ethnically cleansing, and then bombed it. And Pearl Harbor agitated America into taking the Nazis' weapon through Operation Paperclip that created the CIA and MI6 with the Nazis, with the Jewish mob, and with the Italian mafia in order to then create and blow up the atomic bomb on 200,000 Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then we entered into the strategic escalation of other people having nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. And America and the dollar and the deep state that was set up was the one that profited from that whole network as they created a criminal network via Vatican Bank. And then they used these wars in order to create institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlement, in order to profit from all of that war. And finally, enough economic power was built up because America decided to steal all the wealth from their people and hand it over to the global network of banks that then set up an alternative stateless power structure that is asset stripping the last remaining wealth from the host nations while it reinvests into a new multipolar world order. All because China had a plan. And that plan was to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to allow for a two-state solution so that after this operation, you could end up into a region of peace in the Middle East where America strategically retreats by aligning with the GCC and the BRICS and ASEAN that can finally free itself from the dollar and change into a multipolar structure that benefits those that own gold, that benefits those that own Bitcoin, and recognize that if you want to sabotage all of that operation, then what you would do is China would reunify with Taiwan. Taiwan would then blow up all of the factories that have the Silicon Shield defense mechanism that would then send the world into a global recession that would blow up all of the assets, all of their investments in America. It would send China into a spiral because now we've got no artificial intelligence, no electricity industry, no Magnificent Seven, no technology, no Alibaba, because all of them rely upon the smooth semiconductor chips, it would create $2.2 trillion of economic destruction, and it would undo everything that it had achieved. And so if America, under the neocon model, under Biden, of the military industrial complex, it would agitate that war. But China will never fall for that, because it knows, do the maths. Reunifying with Taiwan is just an absolute boogie monster lie, because it would destroy and be no good for anybody, because China doesn't want to build its economy based upon war. It now has aligned, and we have a new model and a new economy that for the first time can decolonize the global south, decolonize Africa, decolonize the institutions that were originally colonized by the Brits and then colonized by America. And if it wants to screw all that up, it would go to war. So they are pushing absolute ridiculous narratives, because that's the exact model that propped up the dollar. And so either they're pushing out states propaganda to make you believe that China's going to war. Why? Because just like Keir Starmer, who is, rather than looking after the British people, he is entering into a 100-year agreement with the corrupt politician Zelensky so that Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon and BlackRock can take all of the last money from the Europeans at the expense of the European people, and the last money from the Brits at the expense of the British people, as they want the last money from the Americans at the expense of the American people, by sending all that money, because they need profits to go away from the Middle East, and they need those contracts to go to Europe. So they need Hitler, they need Putin to be the next Hitler, and they need Xi Jinping to be the next Hitler. And you need to have a commie attack and a manufactured narrative. And any narrative that you get around that, look what happened during 9/11. 9/11 was a narrative just to radicalize the profits that they were going to steal from you, as they created $7.5 trillion of war in the Middle East, that from the start of the Bank of England to today killed 300 million people for the profits of BlackRock in the end, who consolidated that wealth and consolidated that power. And now they need you to believe that the American government works for the American people, and the European government works for the European people, and the British government works for the British people. The Proof of Weapons Network won this model a long time ago. And the real battle has always been us versus them. And they need to divide and conquer to make sure that we don't recognize that we have decentralized power. We have Bitcoin that allows us to exit and boycott the system. We can de-weaponize their system by not borrowing their debt in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. We can stop investing and using their systems and instead purchase local. And we can build decentralized systems of decentralized artificial intelligence, decentralized money, and Bitcoin already set the model. We already defeated the Federal Reserve because BlackRock had to join us when they laughed at us when we first started with Bitcoin. And so now let's look at section 3, where we're going to go through this week in geopolitics and understand some of the games, so that you can understand how BlackRock does not give a shit about you, because through its Proof of Weapons network, it is willing to engage in ethnic cleansing, genocide, war, rape, massacre, pillaging, and destruction. And we get to, for the first time in my lifetime, generationally, finally end up with a multipolar world where the boot of the US dollar gets to liberate the world if we can actually do the promise of capitalism, which is competition based upon hard money. And so let's have a look at the geopolitical section. Look, if you enjoyed this, you can either say, I work for the China Communist Party and I'm doing propaganda, or you can just simply follow the money, step into Common Sense Corner, and recognize I'm not telling you how I want the world to be. I'm telling you how the world is. And if you don't prepare for it, your politicians are going to wreck you, and you're going to be slaughtered to BlackRock because they work for them and they don't give a shit for you. And you can look what they're doing to countries, and you don't think that they're willing to do that to your country. Have a look what they did in Britain. Have a look what they did in Europe, and have a look at all those homeless people that went and fought those wars and are mentally ill, addicted to drugs in a network that the CIA created. Those drugs are not coming from China. They're coming from the CIA, because that's what the CIA was created for in the first place. And they may get resources by co-opting and raping and pillaging Afghanistan and funding groups in order to make you think that the boogie monster terrorists are trying to take away your freedom, when really these are groups that were trained by the CEO, by the CIA, for the profits of the military-industrial complex, to prop up black ops and drug trafficking so that they could get their country addicted to drugs and create an opium war in their own country, just like they did to China. Just like we did to China, that led to the creation of HSBC, that was the original money laundering for all the drug trafficking, so that we could famine 50 million Bengalis and steal the wealth of the gold and the silver from China and America that all ended up in Fort Knox, so that we could weaponize this network to steal resources. And now finally we get to change that order, and that's why I like it. So let's move into part 3. And in part 3, I'm going to take a quick water break, and I'd like you to like, share. I'd like to share this information. Put a comment below. Let me know what you think about this, and help me get over to 100,000 subscribers. And if you would like content to prepare for this for free, head over to simondixon.com and create a free access and membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I'm going to be creating free video series where I break down exactly how to prepare for this, and what types of things you can do. I'm going to be releasing that in early 2026 as well. But we'll make sure you've got all the Great Depression of the video, Great Depression of the 2020s video series, the digital copy of my previous books, and a backup in case they take us down anyway of all of these previous broadcasts. And please subscribe to the podcast, Spotify and Apple, so you can download it. And when you're doing no extra time, you can actually listen to it while you're driving, doing your cleaning, doing your workout, or whatever you're doing, so that you can double up your time as well by listening to that on that podcast. I really appreciate that. If you're enjoying this, I will keep creating content as long as it makes a difference from you, and you help me get this message out there, because we're starting to get momentum. Why? Because BlackRock wants to strategically weaken the dollar. So the YouTube algorithm has stopped censoring me, and suddenly the subscribers are now getting notifications, because AI is controlling that algorithm. And it looks like in this moment, me revealing the truth is aligned with the agenda. So what does that say about what they want? Why do you think we're getting freedom of speech all of a sudden? We're not necessarily freedom of reach, but when your message aligns with them and AI, suddenly my subscribers go up and my videos get more views, because before they didn't want that. And so please help me get over to 100,000 so I can get the blue check on YouTube. And please follow me on all the different channels, because at some point my message won't be aligned with them, and we'll need to go to the backup on simondixon.com and the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Right. We're going to go into the part 3. Geopolitics. Please help me put a comment, like, share right now. I'm going to take some water, and I'm going to jump into the next section.